This kind of self-love is not performative. It is not something displayed for validation or attention. It functions like an internal shield, practical, steady, and unshakable. It naturally blocks manipulation, guilt-driven persuasion, and emotional pressure that would normally work on an unhealed empath. Their boundaries are no longer flexible to please others. They are firm, deliberate, and clearly defined. They know exactly what they will no longer accept, and they no longer negotiate their core standards for anyone. When this level of inner clarity meets a narcissist's unstable, ego-driven personality, the interaction doesn't just become uncomfortable, it becomes destabilizing. The narcissist depends on confusion, emotional reactions, self-doubt, and the tendency of others to question their own perception. That is where their control lives. But a super empath no longer operates from confusion. Their perception is sharp, direct, and grounded in reality. They see behavior as it is, not as it is presented. The masks, the contradictions, the emotional performances, they become obvious. Because validation is no longer something the super empath seeks, the narcissist loses access to their usual influence. There is no emotional leverage to pull, no insecurity to exploit, no dependency to feed on. What remains is a person who cannot be steered or reshaped through pressure. This is why the narcissist doesn't simply lose an argument with a super empath. Their entire control system begins to break down. Their tactics stop landing. Their usual strategies, guilt, confusion, charm, intimidation, fail to produce the expected response. It is not resistance in the emotional sense. It is absence of reaction where reaction used to be. At the core, narcissistic behavior is built on entitlement. They carry an internal assumption that they deserve attention, compliance, and emotional investment without equal respect or accountability in return. Relationships, in their view, are not mutual spaces but extensions of their needs. Other people become sources of validation rather than individuals with boundaries. A super empath interrupts this structure in a way most people never do. They question it directly, not from fear, not from guilt, and not from the need to preserve harmony at their own expense. They understand that peace built on self-abandonment is not peace at all. So instead of staying silent, they respond with clarity. When entitlement shows itself, it is met with calm but firm truth. Instead of explaining, justifying, or softening reality, they challenge the assumption behind the behavior. This level of directness disrupts the narcissist's expectation completely. It is like expecting obedience and receiving reflection instead. The super empath does not escalate emotionally, which removes the dynamic the narcissist tries to provoke. There is no dramatic reaction to feed off, no chaos to control. Instead, there is steadiness. When they say no, it is not emotional, it is final. When they set a boundary, it does not shift under pressure. Over time, this consistency exposes the fragile nature of the narcissist's perceived authority. What once felt powerful begins to feel hollow. Control that depended on compliance collapses when compliance is no longer available. Narcissists also rely heavily on emotional exploitation. They often position themselves as victims, switching roles when they feel their influence weakening. They may use guilt, crisis, or emotional storytelling to regain sympathy and pull others back into their orbit. For many people, this works because empathy naturally responds to distress. But a super empath reads beyond the surface. They recognize when emotional displays are being used as leverage rather than genuine vulnerability. They do not get pulled into reactive patterns. They observe without being absorbed. This is where their awareness becomes protective rather than draining. Instead of reacting with anger, explanation, or emotional investment, they withhold the response the narcissist is trying to extract. They do not offer fuel in the form of emotional chaos. They remain composed, grounded, and selectively engaged. Their empathy is no longer automatic. It is intentional and earned. This shift changes everything. The narcissist loses access to emotional supply. Without reactions to feed on, their strategies lose effectiveness. The more the super empath remains centered, the less control the narcissist can maintain. In this state, the super empath does not become cold or unfeeling. They become discerning. Their compassion is no longer open-ended. It is protected by awareness. They can recognize manipulation without being absorbed by it, and they can care without being consumed. At the deepest level, narcissistic behavior depends on a fragile, constructed identity that requires constant external validation to feel real. When that validation is no longer available, the structure begins to weaken, and when it is consistently withheld by someone who no longer doubts themselves, the illusion they depend on cannot hold its shape. This is why the presence of a super empath feels so destabilizing to a narcissist. It is not confrontation that breaks the pattern. It is clarity, consistency, and the refusal to abandon self-truth. And that is where the dynamic fundamentally changes. They are like a balloon that constantly needs air, praise, admiration, and the sense of being above everyone else to stay inflated. Without that steady supply of validation, they collapse inward into a quiet but consuming state of shame they cannot tolerate facing. To protect themselves from that inner collapse, a narcissist builds a mental hierarchy where they place themselves at the top. In their mind, they are exceptional, above the rules, and entitled to special treatment. This self-made illusion becomes the structure that holds their identity together. But a super empath does not participate in that illusion at all. They do not look up at the imagined throne, and they do not bow to it. That simple refusal becomes deeply disruptive to the narcissist's entire sense of reality. What once depended on recognition and admiration suddenly has nothing to stand on. While most people may feel pressured by confidence, status, or intimidation, the super empath sees beyond the performance. The image, the charm, the dominance, all of it is recognized as a constructed layer hiding deep insecurity underneath. To them, superiority is not real, it is acted. Because of this grounded perception, the super empath holds a belief that does not shift with personality or power. Every person has equal inherent value. No title, money, attitude, or arrogance can override that basic truth. And that equality-centered mindset directly challenges the narcissist's need to feel above others. When a narcissist attempts to assert dominance, belittle someone, or establish superiority, the super empath does not respond with fear or submission. Instead, they calmly reflect back what is actually happening. They expose the insecurity behind the behavior without escalating emotionally or getting pulled into chaos. They are able to take the narcissist's own language, logic, and contradictions and gently turn them back toward clarity, not as an attack, but as exposure. The behavior is no longer allowed to hide behind tone or intimidation. It is seen for what it is. This does not mean the super empath engages in arguments or power struggles. They do not compete for dominance. Instead, they remove participation from the illusion entirely. They stop reinforcing the fantasy the narcissist relies on. And when that reinforcement disappears, something important begins to shift. The narcissist is no longer treated as an exceptional figure whose behavior must be carefully managed. They are simply treated as a person accountable for their actions. That shift alone removes the special status they depend on for emotional control. At the core of narcissistic behavior is a deep inner contradiction. Beneath the arrogance, there is often unresolved shame, self-loathing, and emotional instability that was never integrated. Because those feelings are too painful to face directly, they are pushed outward onto others. This is where projection begins. The narcissist assigns their own internal experiences to the people around them. Accusations like "you are selfish," "you are crazy," or "you are lying" often reflect internal states they cannot tolerate within themselves. It is not communication based on truth. It is emotional displacement. For someone without awareness, these projections can feel like real attacks that must be defended against. But a super empath perceives them differently. They recognize the pattern rather than absorbing the content. They see that the emotional discharge is not actually about them. Because of this clarity, the insults lose their impact. They no longer land as identity-shaping statements. Instead, they are understood as externalized emotional noise with no stable foundation. When someone has a strong internal sense of self, those projections cannot attach. At times, the super empath may even perceive the narcissist differently, not as powerful or threatening, but as emotionally underdeveloped. Their outward confidence can be seen as a cover for unresolved emotional immaturity, where reactions resemble impulsive outbursts rather than grounded responses. This shift in perception changes the emotional dynamic completely. It becomes difficult to feel destabilized by someone who is clearly operating from unresolved inner conflict. The emotional charge of their behavior begins to dissolve. So when blame shifting, gaslighting, or distortion appears, the super empath does not rush to defend themselves. They do not engage in lengthy explanations or attempts to prove their reality because they recognize that truth is not the goal in that moment. Control is. Instead, they remain anchored, observant but not entangled, calm but not reactive. The behavior is witnessed without being absorbed. In that state, the narcissist's attempts to transfer emotional confusion fail to take root. The projections return to their source instead of landing in the target. What was meant to destabilize the other person loses its direction. This is what makes the super empath so resistant to manipulation. Not because they fight harder, but because they no longer participate in the emotional exchange the narcissist depends on. They stay rooted in clarity while distortion loses its grip. Most people try to meet narcissistic behavior on an emotional battlefield, arguing, defending, explaining, or reacting. But that is exactly where the cycle continues. A super empath does something different. They disengage from emotional chaos and respond from awareness instead of reaction. What this passage is really describing is a shift in psychological awareness. How someone moves from being emotionally reactive in toxic dynamics to becoming observant, grounded, and internally stable. At the beginning, the idea is that a person starts to recognize patterns instead of seeing each situation as something completely new or random. In unhealthy relationships, especially those involving manipulation, there are often repeating cycles. Things may begin with intense attention or affection, then shift into criticism, emotional withdrawal, confusion, or control tactics. At first, these changes feel chaotic and personal. The emotional experience is intense, so it's hard to step back and see structure in it. But over time, through experience and reflection, a person starts noticing repetition. They begin to realize that what felt unpredictable actually follows a pattern. This is an important psychological shift because the brain moves from emotional immersion to observation. Instead of thinking, why is this happening to me? The awareness slowly shifts toward, I've seen this before. This is where emotional distance begins to form, not as detachment from feelings, but as the ability to observe feelings without being completely controlled by them. The storm is still present, meaning the emotional intensity of the situation hasn't disappeared, but the person is no longer standing in the center of it. Mentally, they step back and start watching what unfolds, instead of being fully pulled into it. From this perspective, interactions stop feeling like emotional battles that need immediate reaction. Instead, they start to look like sequences of behavior. Each action is no longer isolated. It is connected to what came before and what usually follows after. This creates pattern recognition. And with pattern recognition comes foresight, the ability to anticipate likely outcomes based on previous cycles. So instead of reacting impulsively to every moment, the person becomes more measured. They are no longer surprised in the same way because the structure behind the behavior is becoming familiar. This doesn't mean they approve of it or feel unaffected by it emotionally. It means they are no longer psychologically disoriented by it. A key part of this shift is the relationship with reality itself. In manipulative dynamics, reality often becomes unstable. Things may be denied, twisted, or reinterpreted in ways that make the other person doubt their own memory or perception. This creates confusion, and confusion creates emotional dependence. If you doubt your own experience, you rely more on the other person's version of events. But when someone becomes more grounded, they stop engaging with that instability in the same way. Instead of entering arguments about what is true, they rely on consistency. What has been said, what has been done, and what patterns are repeatedly visible over time. This creates an internal anchor. Even if someone else tries to distort the narrative, the person no longer loses their sense of what actually happened. At this stage, The mind becomes less reactive and more structured. There is less emotional escalation and more internal processing. The person is no longer trying to win emotional arguments or convince someone else to see reality. Instead, the focus shifts toward maintaining their own clarity. That distinction is important. The goal is no longer external validation, but internal stability. In some cases, people may begin documenting experiences, not as a way to escalate conflict, but as a way to protect their own clarity when confusion is being introduced. Writing things down, remembering patterns, or keeping track of events is less about confrontation and more about preserving a stable reference point. It helps prevent the erosion of memory that often happens in manipulative environments. As this process continues, energy management becomes a major shift. Instead of constantly explaining, defending, or emotionally engaging in cycles that go nowhere, the person starts conserving their emotional energy. They begin to recognize that not every situation deserves a response, and not every behavior requires participation. This is where boundaries start to become more active rather than theoretical. Boundaries are no longer just ideas about what should or should not happen. They become lived actions, what the person chooses to engage with and what they step away from. This reduces emotional exhaustion because energy is no longer being spent on endless clarification or repair attempts in situations that are fundamentally repetitive. What changes most deeply is internal positioning. Earlier, the emotional state may have been driven by urgency, fear of loss, guilt, or the need to be understood. These emotional drivers often lead to over-explaining, over-giving, or staying too long in unhealthy dynamics. But as awareness develops, those internal pressures weaken. The person starts responding from clarity rather than emotional urgency. Clarity is a very different state from reaction. Reaction is fast, emotional, and often automatic. Clarity is slower, more grounded, and based on observation rather than impulse. When someone operates from clarity, they are less easily influenced by emotional pressure because they are no longer internally dependent on approval or reassurance to feel stable. This is where the idea of not being easily manipulated comes from in the passage. It doesn't mean being cold or disconnected. It means not having emotional instability that can be exploited. If someone no longer needs constant validation, then withdrawal of validation loses its controlling power. If someone no longer doubts their own perception, then distortion has less effect. At this stage, identity becomes more solid. The person is not defining themselves through the relationship, the conflict, or the other person's behavior. Instead, they are rooted in their own sense of self. This reduces emotional volatility because their internal state is not constantly being shaped by external reactions. So rather than being defined as someone against toxic behavior, they become someone anchored in themselves. Their attention is not scattered across confusion, emotional triggers, and reactive cycles. It becomes more focused, intentional, and stable. This creates psychological independence, not in the sense of isolation or emotional shutdown, but in the sense of self-trust. The person no longer needs constant external input to determine what is real or how they should feel about it. That internal trust is what changes the entire dynamic. Finally, the deepest shift described in the passage is the move from survival mode to choice. Survival mode is driven by fear, emotional dependency, and the need to fix or maintain unstable connections. Choice, on the other hand, is calm and deliberate. It is the ability to decide where energy goes, what deserves attention, and what is no longer part of one's life. At that point, the transformation is not about winning conflicts or exposing others. It is about no longer participating in cycles that require self-abandonment. And that is the real turning point, the moment when a person stops trying to survive emotional chaos and starts living from internal stability instead. In conclusion, this entire idea is really about inner transformation, not confrontation. It shows a shift from emotional confusion to clarity, from reacting blindly to observing consciously, and from being pulled into toxic cycles to recognizing them for what they are. Over time, what once felt chaotic and personal begins to reveal a pattern, and that pattern awareness becomes the first step toward freedom. As this awareness deepens, the need to argue, explain, or emotionally defend yourself starts to fade. Instead of trying to change other people or prove reality, the focus moves inward toward protecting peace, preserving truth, and maintaining emotional stability. Boundaries become clearer, energy is used more wisely, and self-trust replaces self-doubt. The real change is not about becoming stronger than others or winning difficult relationships. It is about becoming so grounded in your own sense of reality that manipulation, confusion, and emotional pressure lose their power to destabilize you. You stop living in reaction to others and start living from your own center. The message is simple. True emotional independence comes when you no longer abandon yourself to maintain connection. When you choose clarity over confusion, truth over distortion, and self-respect over approval, you step out of survival mode and into conscious living. That is where real healing begins and where your power quietly returns to you.